Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're broadcasting to you on Channel 9 and on WJOPLP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also available on our YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted to welcome today's guest. Dr. Rachel Fish is here to help us increase our awareness and understanding of anti-Semitism and ways to hopefully stop it. Dr. Fish is a celebrated academic with 20 years of experience in the fields of Israeli history, Zionist thought, and Middle Eastern studies. She was the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Antisemitism, which was established to catalyze new solutions to the sadly age-old hatred advanced by those who seek the elimination of Judaism and the Jewish people and the modern movement to destroy the world's only Jewish state. Dr. Fish also served as the executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. She completed her doctorate degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis. And in 2015, she held the Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard, where she lectured on modern Israel and received the Derek Box Certificate of Teaching Excellence. She's also the co-editor of the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. And just as impressive as her academic and teaching credentials is the description she gives of herself on the homepage of her website, scholar/warrior. And I can't think of a better superpower to have, Rachel. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. Especially during these times when there sadly has been such a disturbing increase in the rise of anti-Semitic hate crimes in the US. It had already been on the rise over the last few years, but recently with the clash between Hamas and the Israeli military, it surged to really disturbing and worrisome proportions. And the spike appears to be, related to a kind of a conflation and confusion about anti-Semitic prejudices and mythologies on the one hand, and criticism of the policies and actions of the current Israeli government and Israeli military on the other. And more heat than light is often expressed on these topics. And so I'm really glad you're here, hopefully to amplify the light. Rachel, could you help us understand, as we begin, the defining hallmarks of anti-Semitic views and stereotypes, and how we can detect these anti-Semitic hallmarks within or even fueling some forms of criticism of the Israeli government's policies?
So you're asking a really important question, Mary, and I think it's important to put this a little bit in terms of a historical context to understand the ways in which Jew hatred has transformed over time. We know that the early stages of Jew hatred, we would refer to really as Judeophobia, or hatred of Judaism, or the adherents who believed in Jewish practices. These, this kind of idea was that this concept of Judaism was being in formation and in distinction to Christianity. And it was during a time in which Christian politics and state politics were deeply enmeshed with one another. And the church, meaning the Catholic Church, really developed the worldview and the orientation of the kings, right? Of the leaders of societies, of empires. So that kind of hatred towards Jews, and because of their beliefs, you begin to see certain tropes that emerge. One of the most important and dangerous being the blood libel. The idea that Jews were accused of having sort of this nefarious, insidious behavior in which they're trying to seduce the non-Jewish child away from the Christian family, use the blood of that child for the creation of holiday practices, liturgical practices, traditions during Passover and other holidays, and harming innocent children. And then that idea actually becomes a transnational idea and crosses through Europe into the Middle East. And it was probably one of the most pervasive and really dangerous tropes that exist in terms of the hatred coming towards the Jewish community. We then move to a period of time in which Jews are hated because of their perceived racial identity. Again, beginning in a European framework. But the idea here is that Jews were the consummate other. They are not Aryan. They are deemed to be Eastern or Oriental. That's how Jews are written about in a European context. And because of that, Jews are seen as being problematic in terms of the ways in which they are integrating into society. They become the scapegoat for societies.
Yeah.
And it's because of their identity as a particular type of people that is in juxtaposition to what the true European ought to look like. In the modern form of anti-Semitism, and that is when the term anti-Semitism comes about. In 1897, Antisemitismus, that term, a German term, is coined by Wilhelm Marr, specifically towards the Jewish community, because that concept of Jews being Semitic, coming from a particular geographical location, having certain characteristics that are shared, that's how Jews then are identified as Semite. So that is not a term that's used for other people coming from that area of the Levant or the Mediterranean. It's specific to Jews. What we see in the modern formation of the way anti-Semitism manifests itself is that we still have hatred of Jews because of their religious identity. We still have hatred of Jews because they are deemed not to be white. They are deemed not to be, part of the larger societies in which they are living. They are the other. But we also see that there is a hatred towards the creation and the existence of the Jewish sovereignty. The idea of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, the starting point has been, does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer has been no. Now, no other nation state is their right to exist questioned. De facto, these states exist. But when it comes to the conversation around Israel, what we're really talking about is this sense that Jews holding real power and the ability to have agency and self-determination, there's a suggestion that because Jews are perceived as being part of a white European colonialist and imperialist framework, that then extends to Israel also being an imperialist colonialist outpost in a region that is articulated as oppressing the indigenous people of color who are Palestinian. That's the framework. It's a trope that's being used. So Jews in this equation then are seen as being part of a supremacy, kind of supremacist orientation in which Jewishness is privileged over any other identifying, attribute. And therefore, Israel is behaving in a way that is racist. That's the language that we hear that is being used. And that language has been developing for decades. And it didn't just appear overnight, but it's another way in which Jew hatred exists and presents itself today.
Oh, Rachel, that is so helpful. It creates the context because that is exactly the kind of language that you're hearing people express now. And you've really clarified the underlying anti-Semitic assumptions and tropes that go way back in history. So thank you for that. We've been joined by Alex Matthews. He is the congregational leader of Ahavas Achim here in Newburyport. Welcome, Alex. It's nice to see you. And Alex,
hi, Mary. It's nice to see you again.
And I know that you were here on the tail end of what Rachel was responding, but I wonder if you have some follow-up questions for Rachel on what she was just talking about.
Yeah, and hi, Dr. Fish. I want to thank you so much for joining our community in this really timely and important conversation. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your remarks, but I am hearing you kind of establish some of the connections between what's happening in Israel and Palestine and how we see that manifesting itself in American in American society a little bit more. I guess I'm wondering, just if you can clarify a little bit further why the recent violent conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians led to a surge in anti-Semitic acts. And
Alex is frozen. Let's see if we can unfreeze Alex, but perhaps Rachel, you could respond to the beginning part and hopefully we'll get his image unfroze. I know that he was curious to find out about the uptick in not just anti-Semitic views, but anti-Semitic violence.
Yes, absolutely.
Currently, and what could be done to fend this off with future kinds of conflicts, because they're seems like there's likely to be future conflicts of one kind or another. So
That's right. So I want to say a few things because I deeply care about precision of language as
Yeah.
someone who's trained as a historian.
sure.
So the most recent conflict, I would say, is a conflict between Hamas and Israel.
Mhm.
I'm careful not to say all Palestinians because Palestinians in the West Bank, Fatah, the political leadership of Palestinians in the West Bank, did not engage directly in the way that Hamas was engaged.
Mhm.
Hamas is a terrorist organization that controls the territory of the Gaza Strip. It has had full autonomy over that territory since Israel unilaterally withdrew from that territory. And Jewish settlers who lived in the Gaza Strip were relocated into other parts of Israel proper, and some chose as well to move to the West Bank. That conflict that we saw between Hamas and Israel was really an attempt in many ways for Hamas to be able to, quote unquote, defend Palestine and defend Jerusalem during a month, the holy month of Ramadan, during a time in which there were increased tensions in the city of Jerusalem from issues related to Sheikh Jarrah, which is an Arab neighborhood, but there's a Jewish quarter in the neighborhood. And this is a dispute around territory and property that has existed since the 19th century, and one that the Supreme Court in Israel is trying to navigate and come to a decision to address. This is also about the tensions that were increased because of the way in which Al-Aqsa Mosque during the month of Ramadan was being under heavier sort of military/police presence. This is also during a time in which you had many both holy days and national secular holidays like Jerusalem Day, Israeli Independence Day, the Palestinians' recognition of Al-Nakba, which is considered to be the catastrophe when Israel was established. So these kinds of really heavy, important moments in civic national identity. All of these pieces led to a moment in time in which Hamas thought this was an opportunistic time to leverage these tensions in order to be able to display Fatah's impotency. Fatah is the Palestinian Authority's main political party. The leader of Fatah is Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. He has not had elections. Fatah has not had elections in the past 15 years. He has been the leader, partly because he's concerned about who will fill that void, because there is a real chance it will not be Fatah leadership. So this is a way for Hamas to be able to demonstrate its identity as the true protectors of a Palestinian national conversation. That's separate from the strife that was felt between Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, who are living in cities that are mixed cities with Israeli Jews, where there has been increased tension, where the Israeli state has not provided fairly and adequately for Palestinians who are living in those cities, who have been complaining with real reason for several years now that there is an increase in crime, increase in violence, increase in gambling and drug concerns, and seeking for serious Israeli governance and more presence, again, of police in order to quell these issues. We know that in the last 2 years, there have been 4 Israeli national elections and has not led to a stable government, which means there has not been much governance on these fronts, which is part of the problem. We are on the brink of seeing whether or not a potential coalition can be formed, and we will see in about 12 days whether or not that happens, and it will be a very different type of coalition, including someone who's considered to be left of center, right? Lapid, Yair Lapid, who also is a Reform Jew, which is different from Reform in America, to someone like Naftali Bennett, who's coming from a right of center ultra-nationalist party, but he identifies as a religious Jew, wears a kippah on his head all of the time, to a conservative Islamist Arab party, Ra'am, with Mansour Abbas. So we're talking about a very different type of coalition that could exist within the state, but it's yet to be seen. Okay, so how does this relate to what's happening in this country? What we have seen is that the conversation in this country has been a conversation in which the identity of Jews in diaspora and also Israelis, we are focused on hearing from within the social justice conversation that Jews are held accountable for the behavior and the actions of the state of Israel.
Yes.
And that is being intertwined with one another and becomes quite difficult to disentangle.
Yeah.
Again, because we hear the language that Israel is an oppressor state. We hear the language that Israel is an apartheid state. We hear the conversation that Zionism is equal to racism, which is reminiscent of the 1970s, when we saw that UN Resolution 337 brought to the United Nations by the Arab world, suggesting that Zionism is racism. And now it's taken to another degree where it's Zionism is a form of Jewish supremacy, trying to equate it to the conversation here in America about white supremacy.
Yeah.
Well, if you take all of these pieces, what is happening is that there is a specific litmus test that exists within the progressive political spectrum on the American scene. And that progressive political litmus test says, you must be anti-racist, you must be anti-homophobic, you must be anti-transphobic, you must be anti-Islamophobia, you must be against misogyny. Many of those things we can all agree with. Many of us care deeply about fighting those forms of hatred and bias and discrimination. But lumped into that is you also must be anti-Zionist and you must dissociate from any connection with the state of Israel. Anti-Zionist in this particular framing isn't actually a position of anti-Zionism as we have seen, which has existed within the history of Jewish responses in terms of challenges and opportunities Jewish communities have faced when living in periods of diaspora. Anti-Zionism in this case becomes a politically acceptable form of anti-Semitism because this is not about complex, nuanced discussions related to should there be a green line, where the green line should be, should there be a settlement, should there not be a settlement, are we talking about issues related to refugee? That is not the conversation.
Yeah.
The conversation, again, is the starting point that Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is anachronistic and therefore it ought to be delegitimized. That is the problem.
Yeah. Rachel, thank you so much for that. You did amplify the light and reduce the heat and how to think about and how to talk about these issues. And it is enormously complex. And I think if there's one thing we can all take, as well as the historical complexity from what you're saying, it's that none of us should rush to judgment, because it's very clear that you spent years studying this, you know it very well, and all of us should refrain from assuming that we know enough to assess what's going on or make a judgment, especially the ones that have an underlying anti-Semitic slant to them, as you've been clarifying. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. I want to expand our conversation now to anti-Semitism in a larger and historical sense, because it just feels timeless and ubiquitous in world history in ways that to me seem totally and weirdly disproportionate, first of all, to the actual population of Jews in the world, especially after the genocide of 6 million Jewish persons during the Nazi era. How do you understand, you've talked about this a little bit, but I'm hoping you can expand on it. How do you understand the perennial choice of the relatively small minority of Jews in the world? I think it maxes out at 2%, as a scapegoat and target for blame for so many things. No matter how absurd the claims. For example, one notion is that Jews are communist, and simultaneously there's a notion that, well, you know, they're the ultimate capitalists and they run the worldwide banking system. And these, of course, don't go together, but cognitive dissonance about issues like this, they don't seem to prevent irrational beliefs and prejudices from taking hold. So I was hoping that you could help us understand better what gives these lies their staying power, and with whom do they find such a loyal and seemingly unquestioning audience?
So I think you're asking sort of the $1 million question here, Mary. You know, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred is a form of hatred that has existed for millennia. I tend to fall as a realist. I don't imagine that it is going to disappear. I don't think it can be fully eradicated. It's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy theory. And when you have conspiracy theories, they have the ability to mutate over time in order to be able to fill the need of those who are trying to promote, quick scapegoating answers so that they themselves don't have to take responsibility.
Yeah.
So yes, Jews have been socialists throughout history. And yes, Jews have been capitalists throughout history.
Right.
That is the reality. And so what happens is when socialism is being deconstructed, then you have to blame the Jews for the influence of socialism. But when capitalism is succeeding, you have to blame the Jews for the wealth that is existing within our society, right? Like this is what happens. And what you also find is that those who perpetuate this conspiracy theory are often punching up, right? What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
Jews are a people who have not allowed their vulnerability in all societies in which they have lived to keep them in positions of victimhood.
Yeah.
Jews have found ways to overcome those challenges. It doesn't mean that Jews are no longer vulnerable. I want to be clear. You can still be vulnerable without holding on tightly to a victimhood status.
Yeah.
Because Jews don't hold on tightly to that victimhood status and continue to pursue and very often are able to integrate fully into societies in which they are living, reach points of acculturation, some assimilation, high levels of education, socioeconomic upward mobility, and so on, all the more so then Jews are perceived as a threat. And again, if you're looking at this from a right of center position, Jews are hated because they are not white. They are the other, right? In the American context, think about, the South will rise again. Think about Jim Crow laws. This is the Jew always being very clearly understood as not being white. There's a white supremacist ideology. The chants that we heard from Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us.
Yeah.
That's coming from a place of deep fear by those individuals who are saying that. Concern about what it means for them as white, most of them male, right? Christian, who are holding on tight to a hard right political white supremacist ideology. But we also have it on the hard left, right? On the hard left, though, it's upside down. In this case, on the hard left, Jews are white. Jews are no longer vulnerable. Jews are the most privileged. And therefore, that language suggests that it's Jews who are responsible for any minority communities or marginalized voices that face oppression. And Jews ultimately are benefiting from being white and privileged. Now, it is not to say that many Jews are not white passing or white adjacent. Many are. It doesn't mean that Jews are benefiting from a form of white supremacy. That language is very, very problematic. Right? And then the other piece of this is that, again, when that litmus test identifies those progressive elements of where you have to fall on the political spectrum, it becomes very clear that you have to completely dissociate from Israel, because Israel is deemed to be the archetype or the prototype of the sin of what, apartheid and racism look like in the 21st century. And Jews are lumped in with being responsible for that. So from the right and the left, you are caught in between these crosshairs. And there's also radical Islamism, not Islam, but radical Islamism like Hamas and Hezbollah and what we see from ISIS and ISIL, who truly believe that the Jew is the infidel, the Jewish state is the infidel among states, and therefore also has to be disregarded. So this is not an easy position for Jews to navigate. And it's quite challenging, especially the younger you go, because I'll just tell you one little piece, which is the younger you go, they actually have no idea what anti-Semitism means. And I'm not saying that just for Jews, but any population, it doesn't understand the term. We conducted some research and we asked, what is anti-Semitism? With 10,500 13 to 35-year-olds across America, demographically representative. And the majority of people answer very easily, IDK. I don't know, right?
Oh,
that's how they answer. Some who tried to answer said things like, what's a Semite?
Okay. All right.
Is.
Yeah.
But the most common answer we received when we actually got an answer was, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, I'm probably an anti-Semite. And you're
Oh my
thinking,
gosh.
no, you're an anti-Semite,
Yes.
right? But
Oh,
why? Because it's
oh,
not
Rachel.
clear. It's really not clear. The term anti-Semitism
Yeah.
sounds like this pseudo-scientific word.
Mhm.
It's kind of sanitized of what its meaning
Yeah.
is. So it forces us to grapple with, so we need better language,
Yes.
particularly the younger you go. You can
Yeah.
call it hatred of Jews, you could call it
Mhm.
Jew hatred, you could be more specific depending upon the
Right.
context. But the language matters here because many young people who I would put in that don't know category
Mhm.
have no idea what you're talking about when they hear the
Yeah.
term anti-Semitism.
Oh, that's just fascinating. Thank you for sharing that survey research. That's just kind of jaw-dropping. Alex, I think you had a follow-up question for Rachel about some of the recent kind of uses of Holocaust imagery politically. So would you like to ask that question?
Yeah, please. And I'm hoping we do get back to the topic of youth at some point, but I think the point you just made about kind of how nebulous anti-Semitism really is and how hard it is to define brings to mind something that's been on my mind with some kind of baffling and disturbing trends that I've seen popping up in the news, and specifically with kind of Holocaust imagery being co-opted to make offensive political statements. So something like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene comparing mass mandates to the treatment of Jews or not in Nazi Germany, or a story that popped up on my newsfeed about a hat shop in Tennessee selling Stars of David with the word "not vaccinated" on them. Is this a facet of anti-Semitic behavior, or how does things like this fit into the relationship of the United States to Holocaust history and the Jewish people?
Yeah. So I think I would say, Alex, this is very much an anti-Semitic behavior. I think that, again, we see the appropriation of Holocaust imagery and Holocaust language for the current moment being utilized all the time, both by the political right and the political left. We see it regularly. And it's the notion that Jews were responsible for the COVID virus even, and during the early stages of COVID online, every COVID virus that they showed an image of as a cartoon looked like an anti-Semitic stereotypical image that you would see from the medieval time of the way Jews were portrayed. Big noses, nefarious looking faces, beards, and that was supposed to be what the COVID virus looked like under the microscope. You see it from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, for sure. The hat shop in Nashville, which is not, that was one place in which they were trying to use the yellow Star of David, as you saw during the Jews having to wear it in concentration camps. We saw also from a state government in Kentucky that tried to use something similar a few months before the hat shop jumped in on that bandwagon. We've also seen it on the hard left, talking about, again, using that kind of imagery of the Jew being portrayed as the new Nazi and the Palestinian being portrayed as the Jew. So in that same kind of stereotypical Holocaust imagery. So this is a real problem, I would argue, across the board. I do not like when Holocaust language, when Holocaust terminology is appropriated for the current moment. When people refer even to what happened at the Capitol on January 6th with the insurrection, and they called it a Kristallnacht, that's problematic, in my opinion. It's not Kristallnacht. Is it a serious insurrection? 1,000%. Does it point to real issues within our country? Yes. Was it the night of broken glass? No. So I think we have to be very, very careful about using Holocaust, language, Holocaust terminology, and historical moments that occurred during the Holocaust, and not remove them from the historical context in which they took place.
Yeah,
absolutely. Is that out of a sense of sanctity or respect, or does that have to do with kind of watering down what was this really, painful and horrific period in Jewish and European history?
Yeah, well, one, I do think that it takes the experience of what happened for Jews and for the 5 million non-Jews who were murdered out of a context that's not appropriate. Secondly, I truly believe that it is using Holocaust imagery and language to get an emotional stoking. It does not actually for engaging in the complexity or nuance of a discussion in any shape or form. Third of all, we know that what was happening during the Holocaust was happening both top down and bottom up, meaning state government decision and policy making and mobilizing the masses. It's not the same context. So to suggest that it is historically inaccurate. And, that's problematic for me, who's trained as a historian. I don't like to do that.
Well, and for good reason, because I think we need accurate history, or we don't know why things are happening. The context is so important, as you've made clear with pretty much everything that you've been talking about today, Rachel. So thank you for that. I want to be sure and get to. I know Alex has a question about youth, and we'll make sure to get to that. But it's sort of related to that I wanted to ask you about the role that social media plays today, in your view, in terms of spreading disinformation or increasing an audience for lies and delusions. How do you see that working out today?
Not well, Mary.
Yeah.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
Listen, we live in an age of social media. We all know that the value social media has in terms of democratizing information, bringing in voices that normally don't have access to platforms to be heard. That's the good side of social media, right? In addition to like sharing pictures of your kids with your friends that you haven't seen in 20 years, right? That's the nice stuff. That's the good stuff. But that's not how social media works. Social media is based on very sophisticated algorithms. These algorithms work in a way in which you then are aggregated and curated specific content that you see in your social media feed that others don't necessarily see. It creates divisions and siloing so that you are in your echo chamber and you are speaking to the people who already agree with you or who are already like-minded. It doesn't allow for the cross-cultural conversations. It often isn't building bridges between diverse communities, and it doesn't allow an exchange of ideas that can be substantive and meaningful. The other piece of this is that social media, we know that it takes less than 2 seconds to grab someone's attention. If you don't grab someone's attention in less than 2 seconds, you're not going to actually be able to have anything that you put out there engaged with in a serious way. So that means all the kind of things we're talking about, which require serious, substantive conversation that are nuanced, that we want to put into a historical discussion, often that's way too much information that doesn't drive someone emotionally. It's too rational. And people engage with emotion first and then cognitively, rationally later. So social media is preying very much on that emotion and using that emotion in order to mobilize immediate, instant gratification. It's also, as you know, a way that perpetuates a lot of narcissism and egoism. Remember, this is the selfie generation. It's me, right? And it's escapism at the same time. So that's not a place then that's really conducive to having these kinds of conversations. And, my suggestion to people is to be in real relationship, to actually engage with people in real life, go for the walk, have the conversation. Don't just sit there and respond to a statement. However, we do know that very often information or misinformation is put out there for the purpose of promoting a certain political position or platform. And so that becomes then a question for the individual user of how they want to engage. Do they want to respond? They have to decide their intention. For what purpose do they want to respond? Is it to raise questions? Is it to say, can we have this conversation in real life? Is it to dismantle what the other person is saying? And then you have to think about how best to do that and when to say walk away from it. I mean, a kind of gut check is, if you heard someone say this to you on the street, would you respond or would you ignore? And if, depending upon your answer there, probably should be your answer on social. At the same time, I can tell you, when I see very problematic positions that are straight up lies, there are times in which if I have a relationship with that individual, I feel compelled to address it.
You know, Alex, given what we've been talking about, I know that you had a concern and a question for Rachel about youth. So could you share the question that you'd like her to respond to now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. And I think it's also a really great segue from talking about social media, since youth are exposed to just like torrents more information, true and factual and otherwise than ever before. And I guess just if you have any advice for youngsters, Jewish or non-Jewish, who may be encountering anti-Semitism, how does a child or a teenager recognize the line between, something they see on social media, or even like teasing or joking amongst friends, and something that might be truly offensive and hurtful? And how should a child or a young person who may already be feeling stigmatized react in something that feels like a borderline situation? Or is there such thing as a borderline situation?
Yeah, listen, Alex, I think it's like, any kind of community that has faced discrimination in the past, you always have to have some sensitivity when approaching that subject area. And when it's specifically targeting an individual, when it's trying to create a broad, oversimplification and categorization of a community, then something usually is happening that child is feeling, and that child needs to tell his or her parents. They need to tell school administrators. It's if happening in a school situation, if it's happening on a field, tell the coaches. I mean, we need adults to be modeling upstander behavior and supporting students and young people of, all different backgrounds anytime they are feeling insecure about their own identity and are being targeted by other peers because of their identity. In terms of anti-Semitism specifically, I do think that Natan Sharansky, former Soviet refusenik, had created what is referred to as the 3D test. And when you encounter these 3 Ds, they should provide like the sniff test for whether or not this is a form of anti-Semitism. So when you feel demonized, when you see Jews being demonized, that's anti-Semitism. If there's a double standard that Jews or the Jewish state is held to, that is often a form of anti-Semitism. And when you see sort of the delegitimization of a people or of the state, that's another form of anti-Semitism. So for example, if Israel as a state is being portrayed as the worst human rights violator amongst all the countries in the world, you could probably figure out something else is going on here, right? And when Israel is portrayed in an image as being, a typical anti-Semitic image, something else is going on here. That's not, helpful, nuanced criticism of Israeli policy. That's not what it is. There's another intention at play. So we need to help students understand where that line is drawn. That doesn't mean that criticism of Israeli policy is not acceptable. That's not anti-Semitism. That's criticism of Israeli policy. We as Americans criticize the American policy all the time. If we don't, that's not a healthy democracy, right? Israelis criticize Israeli policy all the time. I don't care what sector of Israeli society you're talking about. So that's acceptable, but that's not what we're talking about here. And so students and young people need to understand sort of that, and that 3D test I think is helpful, that when you do encounter that, they should first of all know they don't have to deal with it alone. They really do need to talk to other people. They need to get the support of grownups. There are a lot of individuals who understand how to navigate that terrain because it's not always comfortable. It can be quite isolating, and just to have that emotional support. So speaking to grownups is really the first move I would make. And also it helps students understand, did I experience something that's anti-Semitic, or was it something else and I'm not sure what to label it? And then that can lead to a conversation.
Yeah. those 3Ds, that's very helpful. I like that model. And of course, to underline the idea that don't deal with it alone, talk to somebody is so critical. Rachel, I know we're nearing the end of the time that you have available for us. And this is a larger question than you may have time for in a minute or two. But I would love it if you would speak to the question of why dealing with and eliminating hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism is critically important for everyone.
Yeah, Mary, I mean, this is really, again, a question that's age old, right?
Yeah.
It's a timeless question. And I would say that we know that hatred doesn't start or end only with Jews, right? Anytime we see forms of hatred and prejudice, Jews may be some of the first to be isolated or to be identified, but it never ends just with Jews.
Yeah.
And it's part of, I would say, all of humanity's responsibility to stand up against all forms of hatred, right? I mean, this is why we encourage upstander qualities. It's why our kids, if we see them sitting, on the playground on that buddy bench, we want other kids to come up to them to play with them. We don't want to create a society that's exclusive. We are not looking to create identity politics that privileges one community over another community. So that's not what America is. That's not what America was ever meant to be.
Right.
And we want to create opportunities to bridge into other relationships, to learn from other people's experiences, to build the muscle of compassion and empathy, which often requires us to engage in conversations that can be hard. They can be uncomfortable, but it's a productive discomfort. It's a way to grow and to learn and help us understand other societies, other cultures, other communities, and other voices that exist within the larger communities in which we are living. So I would say that anyone who thinks that they can be silent with any form of hatred ought to re-examine that. And it's seriously as simple as doing the right thing when you encounter it in a conversation at the water cooler at work. It's when you hear something being said at a sporting event. It's when you hear something, in the press and you decide to write a retraction or a newspaper op-ed, whatever it may be. But we actually have to encourage people to do and to stand up for all humanity.
So incredibly well put, Rachel. Thank you. I really appreciate, and I know that you need to be on your way. You have another commitment, but I'm so grateful to you. I've learned so much from you. And you know what? You are a scholar/warrior. You surely are a scholar/warrior. And I can't think of a better way to be in the world. And I think we need more scholar/warriors. So thank you so much for visiting us on the morning show. I really do appreciate it. It's really great.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Alex. It's really a pleasure to meet both of you. Thank you.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah. And Alex, I just wanted to, since we have a few minutes, I know Rachel needs to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I know you have a class to teach. Alex, one of the things that I wanted to add at the end were books are resources for people. And I believe that you saw Professor Lipstadt's presentation. And I've been reading her book, Antisemitism Here and Now. And I can't recommend her book, Antisemitism Here and Now more. It's very accessible. It's written as an exchange of letters between Professor Lipstadt, who's at Emory University and is an international intellectual powerhouse. So I recommend that book, Antisemitism Here and Now by Professor Deborah Lipstadt. I wonder, are there any other books or resources that you want to recommend on this topic, Alex?
You certainly took the number one off the top of my list.
I stole your thunder.
I just think the level of accessibility of that book is just is really, really phenomenal. And in terms of organizations, what comes top to my mind is certainly the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who's just doing, they're doing such wonderful and important work, both in the realm of anti-Semitism, but also in the larger realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really standing up to hatred across all spectrums, and building better alliances and relationships for the Jewish community. And so, just going onto their website and clicking around is really such a wonderful resource. And I'll also say, to give a plug for a local audience, like I'm so happy that we have a Jewish community with an active presence in Newburyport, and I want to put myself out there for people, if they want to get in touch, through our website at caa-newburyport.org. I'm happy to continue conversations. I think so much of what Dr. Fish talked about was relationship building, right? And getting fuller context. And there's plenty of people in the greater Newburyport area who don't know that there's a synagogue in town.
Yes.
And so, wanting to put myself in our community out there as a resource as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you for that, Alex. Just as a footnote, because I watched the feature film, Denial, about Professor Lipstadt, whom we were just talking about, who wrote this wonderful book, wrote a previous book called Denial, about the Holocaust denial. And she was sued by a kind of a faux British historian named David Irving for defamation. And this film, I recommend it to everybody. It's called Denial. This lawsuit took place in around between 1998 and the year 2000. And it is a fascinating film. And the way the issue of Holocaust denial is framed, and the understanding you get of the motives of this faux historian, and the way that Professor Lipstadt's lawyers take him down systematically. It's an excellent film, and it's very educational. I also recommend that to everybody. It's interesting, Alex. Have you seen the film?
I have not. How can I access it?
I got it on Amazon Prime. It just cost a few dollars, but more than worth it. And it's one of those movies where, I knew how it turned out because I just seen Professor Lipstadt give a talk, a few weeks ago. And so I knew that she won because she was talking about it. But that film is so suspenseful. You're on the edge of your seat hoping, oh my God, I hope she wins. Oh my God, I hope she wins. So I want to give a plug to that as well, because I think people would find it very enjoyable. And Alex, I want to thank you for joining us with your wonderful and really important questions today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm Mary, I'm so appreciative for the invitation, and also just, the work you're doing. It can't be easy to be hosting a program on hatred, with regards to the AAPI community one week, and the Jewish community the next week. Like, that's a lot to shoulder. And I'm really glad that you're kind of spurring these conversations in the Newburyport community. And, it's always great to talk to you. And I hope that next time I'm on, it's something, that can be a little bit more lighthearted.
We'll work on that. Thank you so much, Alex. It's always a joy to talk to you. And you are a wonderful resource. And I encourage people to reach out for you. You have much to share. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it will be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon, then on playlist, and then scroll down for the morning show with Mary Jacobsen. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. And again, then the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. It'll also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Thanks. Bye, Alex.
Bye, Mary. Thanks again.
Take good care.
You too.